This is 1 year anniversary of my arriving here. Which means it was the first wedding anniversary for Victoria and Rick. Yeah. You didn't light a candle, man. Yeah. That's all right. I was gone for several weeks, and I worked really hard and not thinking about all the things I was supposed to be doing here, because I knew that if I thought about work, I would miss you all that much more. So, but now I'm back, man. Things to do. All right. Let's start out. Let me explain that at seminary, they use some really odd words. Words that you really just don't encounter anywhere else, like eschatology and hermeneutics, how we make meaning of, okay, and mother help me, conscientizing. Yeah. Oh. Excuse me, can you use that word again in another sentence? I was about 2 years into seminary before I realized that some of the professors were just making up new words. Because their ideas went beyond common English. And so they had to build new word bridges out to those ideas. And I learned, because, if you don't understand, may you have the courage to ask questions. So yeah, and I figured if I don't know it, then probably a lot of us don't know it. So I was the one, okay, can you please define that word? And then there were other words that I thought I already knew. But they were using them in completely odd new ways, like the word anthropology. I thought I knew that word already, the study of human culture. I have a degree in anthropology. I figured I already understood it. No! Because in seminary, you use the word very differently. Religious scholars use the word anthropology to refer to how humans are regarded within a given religion or a theology. A theology that considers humans to be problematic wretches, irredeemable and sinful and miserable, that theology would have a very low anthropology. Okay? A religion that sees human beings as kind of just this mixed bag of charm and deceit, well, that would be kind of a middle anthropology. A religion, a theology that sees humans as being chosen above all other species to mirror their gods, that's high anthropology. Okay. I'm telling you all this to point out the Unitarian Universalism has a very high anthropology. We actually believe that people basically are good and capable of growth, generosity. And more astonishingly, we don't just want it just for ourselves. We believe that all people have inherent worth and dignity, and that they all have the potential for goodness and growth. That's high anthropology. It's a very important detail. And also, we've held this high anthropology for a very long time. A few hundred years by my count. That's also an important detail. Okay, now this sermon is the second in a two-part series on humanism. Specifically, humanism within our Unitarian Universalist tradition. I delivered the first sermon back in early July, but we didn't have the camera rolling, so we don't have a video of it. But if you are just aching to review that sermon, I've put the text up on the minister's blog, so you can just go find it on the website, Humanism 101. Here's a really quick summary of the key points. American humanism was a movement that grew up in the early 20th century, and it sought to bring modernity to religion. Modernity was affecting all aspects of culture, architecture, clothing, literature. The desire was to scrape away the effusive excess, to get down to the essential parts of things. So for humanism, it was to scrape away superstition, supernaturalism, unreasoned thought, prejudice, blind faith. This whole thing is sort of like a progression that began with the Enlightenment. Scientific rigor. It wasn't really linked to any political movement. It was beyond that. It was a philosophical movement, and there were both secular and religious thinkers that advanced the movement. But I want you to know that at its very earliest form, it was considered religious humanism. The term secular humanism was coined later on, and sometimes used as an insult. But for the most part, the real rigorous work was done by often people of religion who did not wish to create a new religion. They wanted to create a new way of being religious. So, for the purposes of this sermon, I'm really just talking about religious humanism. Okay? Now, what I talked about in my previous sermon, this began in the teens, and by the 1920s, there was the American Humanist Association, and they were working diligently, and they created the Humanist Manifesto. Back then, you could do manifestos. It was really all the rage. And they published it in 1933. There was hardly any fanfare. And since then, there have been 2 updates. The most recent, I think, was issued in 2013. It's beautiful. You can go and read it. You're not going to find anything that shakes you to your core there, probably, because at this point, much of what we consider basic humanism has already spread throughout our lives. But let's go back to the first manifesto. I want you to hear the very first statement, their declaration. Religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. Not a God. It self-exists. Their second statement, their second position, humanism believes that man is a part of nature and that he has emerged as the result of continuous process. They're just laying down that whole evolution thing right there out in front. We are not created. We have emerged. Okay? Radical stuff in No, it wasn't that radical. People were beginning, but they were playing it out. They're laying it out. But here's the thing. One of the core aspects of religious humanism is this deep optimism that humans could actually improve and be improved. This is high anthropology. And in the earliest days, humanism was imbued with the sense that all aspects of human life would be improved in this sort of steady upward progression. And at this time, there was ample evidence for this. Science was making amazing strides, inventiveness, new ways of being political and being together, always upward, always getting better. The modern supplanted the old. Sentimentality and blind adherence to tradition, these were stumbling blocks to the advancements of our species and our world. Clear them out. Within Unitarianism, religious humanism took root early in the 20th century. Remember, the Unitarians and Universalists hadn't consolidated yet. Humanism didn't really take as deep a root in Universal. They were too busy being happy. But many of the Unitarian ministers who were the early adopters of humanism, they saw that it was going to be the religion of the future. And it did become a key element of our movement during the 20th century. A lot of our folks came to our congregations specifically because of humanism. And many of our congregations were formed around humanist ideals. There was sort of just the general expectation that we would all gladly shed the shackles of belief, and the entire denomination would embrace this modern way of being religious, bound not by faith, but by reason. And to this day, there are still some congregations that are exclusively humanist. Note my use of the word exclusively. That's intentional. However, despite this sort of general assumption, our contemporary Unitarian Universalism is not now an entirely humanist movement. Humanism is one of our warp threads. It stretches throughout the fabric, the tapestry. It's one of our sources. But it never completely replaced Christianity. And then, stranger still, some of us have taken up other philosophies and theologies, like neo-paganism, Buddhism, religious naturalism, panentheism, finding the holy eminent in all things. What happened? Why aren't we all joyously non-theistic? How did the word spirituality wind up in our congregations? God of our understanding. How did that... when did these events on Sunday mornings become worship services? Why is this a sermon and not just an address or a lecture? What happened? I blame the bomb. You could also blame women or people of color or those young people, but let's just start with the bomb. With the horror of the atomic bomb, even clear-eyed, rational people had to confront the reality that science could kill us all. And the horrors of fascism showed us too clearly that humans were but one demagogue away from depravity. These horrors of the 20th century, they didn't align with that narrative, that the myth of continuous upward progress. It's hard to hold a high anthropology as we counted deaths in the millions. Then we also noticed that our science, our progress, was contributing to some terrible changes in our world. If not the bomb, you could just as easily blame DDT or thalidomide or diethylene stilbestrol, DES, for harming our babies, for the growing sense that perhaps maybe we weren't the pinnacle of all creation. We started having to question our tendency towards human exceptionalism. We can also blame women. The women who saw men traumatized by war. Which war? Any war. The women who noticed that the aspirations of humanism were all set out in the masculine voice. Remember that only one woman was invited to sign the original manifesto. And subsequent updates barely improved that ratio. I think the one in 2013 had 11 women out of 90. Women were among the first to say, I need to feel connected to something larger than just the individual self. And I need something more real than just ideas and ideals. Beginning in the 1980s, women in our denomination began reclaiming the language of spirit and reverence. They were among the first to look back at the older pre-Christian religions to find myths and rituals that spoke to their experiences of suffering, nurturance. They began looking for the feminine aspects of the divine. And that's when things really get exciting. So go ahead, blame the women. You could try, you'd have trouble, but you could try blaming a few strong-voiced people of color who pointed out that much of 20th century humanism failed to speak explicitly to oppression. Because the people who wrote the documents were almost exclusively white, educated men, which means their writings were inherently documents of privilege. Those beautiful, optimistic words only make sense if you are wearing the lenses of the men who wrote them. Men whose vision was obscured, perhaps blind to suffering or grief, helplessness, vulnerability. Those are unmanly conditions. And if you were going to create something new, something bold, something optimistic, would you base it upon weakness or uncertainty? The original manifesto has all these statements. The 11th statement is this: man will learn to face the crises of life in terms of his knowledge of their naturalness and probability. Reasonable and manly attitudes will be fostered by education and supported by custom. We assume that humanism will take the path of social and mental hygiene and discourage sentimental and unreal hopes and wishful thinking. So basically, crisis happens, man up. Clear reason, rational thought will be comfort enough, right? Right? No. Not really, not for all of us. For those of us who have faced oppression, you cannot pull yourself up by your bootstraps if someone has their foot on your neck. Some of us found that we still needed stories to help us make meaning. Indeed, it seems that we are hardwired for story and myth-making. It's something we do as a species. So even discarding the old superstitions, the old stories and myths, we're just going to make new ones. Some of us found, though, that ritual helps us embody, helps us understand big concepts more fully than if we simply sat there and listened to words. Ritual carries us farther than if we just listened to words. Some of us found that we could be more fully human by reclaiming the language of spirit and reverence. So we did something that I like to think we're actually pretty good at. We drew upon our heritage of liberal inquiry, and then we stretched to make the circle wider. Wider, to include neo-pagans and religious naturalists. We stretched wider to include those who strive to live out the teachings of Rabbi Jesus and the Buddha. We stretched wider to hold the religious humanists who see that we are better when we bind ourselves together, religion, and help uphold the lived human experience of the here and now as something holy. We stretched, because this is how we are learning to live with diversity of thought and uncertainty. As I see it, none of us has lost anything. We've all gained and grown in our pursuit of a truly pluralistic society by attempting to have truly pluralistic congregations. How do we do this? Well, we have a covenant. This takes great courage. This takes deep commitment. This takes wild-eyed radicals like each one of you. And I have to say, I'm pretty impressed with the efforts. And I love you all so very much. Blessed be.